Vanessa smirked as the quiet woman in the white sweater was escorted out of the five-star restaurant. "Ma'am, this place is for paying guests," she said loudly while rich customers watched in silence. Claire lowered her eyes and stepped into the rain, clutching a small anniversary gift box. Then suddenly, headlights flooded the marble entrance. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom stopped outside. The entire restaurant froze as a tall man in a navy suit stepped out and the owner whispered in panic, "That's Ethan Bennett." Vanessa's face turned pale when he walked straight past everyone and gently wrapped his coat around the woman she had just humiliated. Vanessa Cole thought throwing the quiet woman into the cold Boston rain would make her look powerful in front of the wealthy guests inside Maison Aurelia, but she had no idea that less than 10 minutes later, the entire restaurant would fall into the kind of silence people never forget. Rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows of the five-star restaurant while crystal chandeliers painted golden reflections across the marble floors. The dining room glowed with elegance. Men in tailored suits discussed investments over 18-ounce steaks and $100 wine. Women in black silk dresses laughed softly beneath the low music of a piano drifting through the room like smoke. Every polished detail inside Maison Aurelia had been designed to whisper exclusivity. And Vanessa Cole protected that image with ruthless precision. At 39, Vanessa carried herself with the sharp confidence of someone who believed appearances defined human value. Her blonde hair was pinned perfectly into place, her black manager's blazer fitted like armor, and her smile changed depending on the wealth of the customer standing in front of her. She noticed watches before faces, shoes before voices. It was a skill she had mastered after years in luxury hospitality. And in her mind, it rarely failed her. Which was why the moment Claire Bennett stepped through the restaurant doors, Vanessa had already decided exactly who she was. Claire entered quietly, almost apologetically, pulling the sleeves of her cream-colored sweater slightly over. Her hands as droplets of rain glistened in her chestnut hair. At 36, she carried herself with calm simplicity. No designer purse. No diamonds flashing beneath the lights. Just worn brown boots, blue jeans, and a small silver gift box tied carefully with a navy ribbon. The hostess behind the marble podium looked at Claire for exactly 2 seconds before her expression cooled. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked flatly. Claire smiled politely. "Yes, Bennett. My husband should already be on his way." The hostess typed briefly into the computer, though she barely seemed interested. "I don't see anything under that name." Claire's smile faded only slightly. "That's strange. He usually handles reservations." Vanessa watched the interaction from across the dining room while carrying a wine list to one of her VIP tables. Her eyes swept over Claire's simple clothing again. The old boots. The sweater from a department store. The nervous way she held the little gift box against her chest. Another woman trying to enter a world she couldn't afford. Vanessa had seen it before. She approached slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor with cold authority. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. The hostess lowered her voice slightly. "She claims she has a reservation, but nothing is showing." Vanessa offered Claire a smile that looked polite from a distance, but carried no warmth at all up close. "Maison Aurelia is reservation only on Friday evenings," she explained smoothly. "Especially during private dining hours." Claire nodded gently. "I understand. My husband arranged everything. Maybe there was a mistake." Vanessa's eyes moved to the tiny silver box in Claire's hands. Probably some cheap anniversary trinket, she assumed. "And your husband is?" Claire hesitated only briefly. "Ethan Bennett." Vanessa repeated the name silently in her head, but it meant nothing to her. Boston was filled with Bennetts. "I see," she replied coolly. Around them, nearby guests had already begun quietly observing the exchange over their wine glasses and candlelit tables. Claire became aware of the eyes turning toward her, but she kept her posture calm. "Would it be all right if I waited?" she asked softly. Vanessa glanced toward the crowded dining room, though several premium tables remained visibly empty near the windows. "Unfortunately, those tables are reserved for paying guests," she replied. The sentence landed harder than a slap. Claire blinked once, clearly understanding the implication. Still, she forced a small smile. I am a paying guest. Vanessa's own smile tightened. Of course. But her tone made it clear she didn't believe her. The room seemed warmer now, heavier somehow. Even the piano music felt distant beneath the growing tension hanging quietly in the air. And outside, beyond the rain-covered glass windows, headlights slowly appeared at the edge of the street. Claire stood quietly near the entrance while the soft murmur of expensive conversations continued around her as if she did not exist at all. The silver gift box in her hands suddenly felt heavier than before. Through the rain-covered windows, Boston glowed with reflections of red brake lights and blurred city neon, but inside Maison Aurelia, warmth and elegance had become something reserved only for people Vanessa Cole considered worthy. Vanessa folded her arms neatly across her blazer and offered the kind of smile that existed only to make rejection appear professional. Perhaps there was confusion with another restaurant, she said smoothly. It happens sometimes. Claire shook her head gently. No. My husband specifically mentioned this place. Vanessa glanced toward the hostess stand, then toward several nearby diners now pretending not to stare. In reality, everyone was listening. People always listened when humiliation entered a quiet room. Madam, Vanessa continued, lowering her voice just enough to sound controlled while still allowing nearby tables to hear every word. Maison Aurelia maintains certain standards for our guests. We simply cannot allow people to wait indefinitely in the lobby during private dinner service. Claire's cheeks warmed. She understood perfectly what Vanessa was really saying. It was not about reservations. It was about appearance. About status. About the silent rules wealthy spaces enforced without ever needing to say them directly. Still, Claire kept her composure. I can wait outside if that makes things easier, she said softly. Vanessa nodded immediately, almost too quickly. I think that would be best. The hostess beside her shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Claire looked down briefly at the small silver box in her hands. Inside was a vintage watch she had spent 6 months restoring herself for Ethan. It had belonged to his late father, and finding the original parts had taken weeks of searching through estate dealers across New England. She had planned tonight carefully. Their anniversary. A quiet dinner. Nothing extravagant. That was the irony of it all. Ethan could have reserved every table in the restaurant if he wanted to. But he hated unnecessary displays of wealth almost as much as Claire did. They preferred simplicity. Realness. Moments that felt human. Yet in places like Maison Aurelia, simplicity was often mistaken for weakness. Vanessa stepped slightly closer now, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I will have someone hold the door for you, she said. The sentence sounded polite, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. Leave. Now. Claire inhaled slowly through her nose and nodded once. All right. As she turned toward the exit, the piano music seemed quieter somehow. Several guests lowered their eyes awkwardly while others watched openly with detached curiosity. A man in a charcoal suit near the wine bar smirked faintly before returning to his bourbon. Across the room, an older woman wearing diamonds whispered something to her husband while glancing toward Claire's worn boots. The entire room had already decided who Claire Bennett was without learning a single thing about her. Just before she reached the door, a soft voice stopped her. Ma'am? Claire turned. A young waitress stood beside one of the service stations holding a glass of water with both hands. She could not have been older than 22. Freckles dusted her cheeks and nervousness filled her expression. Her name tag read Emily. You looked cold, the young waitress said quietly. I thought maybe you might want this while you wait. Claire blinked in surprise. For the first time since entering the restaurant, someone was looking directly at her instead of through her. Claire accepted the glass with a grateful smile. Thank you. Emily lowered her voice even further. I am sorry about this. Before Claire could respond, Vanessa's sharp voice cut across the room. Emily. The young waitress stiffened immediately. Tables 7 and 9 are waiting. Emily quickly stepped back. Yes, ma'am. Vanessa watched the exchange with visible irritation before returning her attention to Claire. Good evening, she said firmly. Claire gave one final nod and stepped outside into the cold rain. The city air hit her immediately, carrying the smell of wet pavement and distant traffic. She stood beneath the awning near the curb, holding the small silver box against her chest while headlights streaked across the soaked Boston streets. Behind the restaurant windows, silhouettes moved beneath golden light and crystal chandeliers. Inside looked warm, untouchable, exclusive. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, trying not to let the humiliation settle too deeply inside her. Then, somewhere down the street, the deep, unmistakable sound of a powerful engine began slowly approaching through the rain. The sound grew louder beneath the rain, deep and smooth, the kind of engine that turned heads long before the car itself appeared. Claire lifted her eyes slowly toward the street as a black Rolls-Royce Phantom emerged through the misty Boston traffic and glided toward Maison Aurelia with silent authority. The polished body reflected the city lights like black glass beneath the storm. Even from inside the restaurant, people began noticing it immediately. Conversations softened. A valet standing near the curb straightened his posture almost instinctively. The Phantom came to a slow stop directly in front of the entrance, where Claire stood beneath the awning, her sweater damp from the cold rain drifting sideways through the wind. For a brief moment, everything seemed strangely still. Then the driver stepped out holding a large black umbrella. Claire recognized him instantly. "Good evening, Mrs. Bennet," he said respectfully while opening the rear passenger door. Inside the restaurant, Vanessa happened to glance toward the entrance at exactly the wrong moment. At first, she only saw the Rolls-Royce. Her expression shifted immediately. Even in Boston's wealthy Back Bay district, cars like that demanded attention. Then she noticed the driver holding an umbrella over the quiet woman she had just removed from the restaurant. A small crease formed between Vanessa's brows. Nearby guests were staring now too. A man seated near the windows lowered his wine glass slowly. The older woman in diamonds leaned closer to the glass to get a better look. Something in the atmosphere had changed. And then Ethan Bennett stepped out of the car. Tall, calm, effortlessly composed. Rain shimmered against the shoulders of his dark navy overcoat while the city lights caught the silver at his cuff links. At 42, Ethan carried the kind of presence money alone could never buy. Quiet confidence. The kind built over years of discipline, intelligence, and absolute control. He thanked the driver softly before his eyes immediately found Claire standing near the entrance. The moment he saw the faint redness around her eyes, his expression changed almost invisibly. Not anger. Something colder. More dangerous. Understanding. Ethan stepped beneath the awning beside her. "Claire," he said gently. "I am sorry I am late." Claire forced a small smile. "Your meeting ran long?" He nodded once. The investors from Singapore delayed the call. His eyes lowered briefly to the silver box still clutched in her hands. "You waited outside in this weather?" Claire hesitated. She never liked creating scenes. Never liked making people uncomfortable. That was part of what Ethan loved most about her. Even now, after being humiliated publicly, she was trying to protect others from embarrassment. "There was some confusion with the reservation," she said quietly. Ethan looked toward the restaurant entrance, where Vanessa now stood frozen near the hostess podium. Their eyes met through the glass. And suddenly Vanessa felt an uncomfortable tightness in her chest she could not explain. She had seen that face before. Somewhere. Somewhere important. Inside the restaurant. Whispers began moving from table to table. "That is Ethan Bennett. Bennett Capital? No way. That is him." The realization spread across the dining room with growing speed. One man nearly choked on his drink before quickly setting down his glass. Another guest immediately pulled out his phone beneath the table. The owner of Maison Aurelia, Richard Laurent, emerged from the private dining hallway adjusting his cuff links after hearing the sudden commotion near the entrance. "What is going on?" he asked sharply. Then he looked outside. And all color disappeared from his face. Richard Laurent knew exactly who Ethan Bennett was. 3 months earlier, Bennett Capital had begun confidential talks regarding a major expansion investment into several luxury restaurant properties across New England. Maison Aurelia was at the center of those discussions. Richard moved quickly toward the entrance, panic rising with every step. "Mr. Bennet," he called out nervously as soon as he pushed through the doors into the rain. "I had no idea you were arriving tonight." Ethan's attention shifted slowly toward him, calm and unreadable. Richard glanced once toward Claire and instantly understood something terrible had happened. Behind him, Vanessa stood motionless inside the glowing restaurant, her face slowly draining of color as the pieces finally began fitting together. And for the first time all evening, the people inside Maison Aurelia stopped looking at Claire Bennet like she did not belong. Rain continued falling softly across the Boston sidewalks, while the glowing entrance of Maison Aurelia stood frozen in stunned silence. Richard Laurent forced a strained smile as he stepped toward Ethan Bennet beneath the awning, though panic flickered clearly behind his eyes. "Mr. Bennet," he repeated carefully, trying to regain control of the situation. "If we had known you were joining us tonight, we would have prepared our private dining suite immediately." Ethan did not answer right away. His attention remained on Claire. A single raindrop clung to the edge of her hair near her cheek, and her fingers still held the small silver box tightly against her sweater. Ethan noticed details the way other people noticed headlines. The damp sleeves. The forced smile. The quiet humiliation she was trying so hard not to show. "Claire," he asked softly, "how long have you been standing out here?" Before she could answer, Vanessa suddenly appeared behind Richard near the doorway. "Sir," she interrupted carefully, "there seems to have been a misunderstanding regarding the reservation system." Ethan finally turned toward her. The look in his eyes was calm. Too calm. Vanessa felt her stomach tighten instantly. Powerful men who shouted were predictable. Men who stayed quiet were far more dangerous. Inside the restaurant, every nearby table had gone silent now. Even the pianist near the corner bar had stopped playing after recognizing Ethan Bennet. Guests watched openly from beneath the golden chandeliers, while servers stood frozen beside half-filled wine glasses and untouched plates. The atmosphere no longer felt elegant. It felt exposed. Ethan stepped slightly closer toward the entrance, shielding Claire from the rain beneath the umbrella. "A misunderstanding," he repeated evenly. Vanessa nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. We simply could not locate the reservation under the name provided." Ethan glanced toward Claire again. "And because of that, my wife was asked to wait outside in 43-degree weather?" The exact temperature did not matter. What mattered was that Ethan had noticed it. Vanessa opened her mouth briefly, then closed it again. Richard stepped in immediately. "Mr. Bennet, I assure you this does not reflect the standards of Maison Aurelia." Ethan's expression remained unreadable. "Interesting." His gaze shifted slowly across the restaurant interior visible through the glass doors. The marble floors. The candlelit tables. The guests pretending not to stare. "Because from where I am standing," he said quietly, "it appears your standards were enforced very clearly." The sentence landed like ice water across the entire entrance. Vanessa felt heat rush into her face. Richard swallowed hard. Claire touched Ethan lightly on the arm. "It is all right," she said softly. "I do not want to ruin everyone's evening." Ethan looked down at her for a moment, and the hardness in his expression softened instantly. That contrast alone did not go unnoticed by the people watching. The billionaire investor everyone in Boston described as intimidating suddenly looked gentle the second he looked at his wife. And somehow, that made the scene even more uncomfortable for the people inside. Because kindness revealed cruelty more clearly than anger ever could. Richard straightened his posture nervously. "Please," he said quickly. "Allow us to correct this immediately. Your table is ready." Ethan did not move. Neither did Claire. The silence stretched painfully across the entrance while rain tapped steadily against the sidewalk. Then, from somewhere behind the dining room, a nervous young voice spoke up. She was very polite. Everyone turned. Emily, the young waitress, stood near the service station clutching a folded linen napkin against her apron. Her face had gone pale the second she realized she had spoken out loud. Vanessa shot her a sharp warning look, but Emily continued quietly anyway. Mrs. Bennet never caused any trouble. She only asked to wait for her husband. The room seemed to tighten around Vanessa instantly. Ethan noticed the waitress immediately. "You brought my wife water," he said calmly. Emily blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir." Ethan gave a small nod. "Thank you." It was such a simple sentence. Yet somehow, it carried more dignity than everything else said that evening combined. Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly, realizing with growing horror that the situation was slipping completely beyond her control. Richard turned toward her sharply now, his polished composure cracking beneath pressure. "Vanessa," he said under his breath, "what exactly happened here?" Vanessa struggled to answer. Because for the first time that night, the problem was no longer Claire Bennett standing outside the restaurant. The problem was everyone inside finally seeing themselves clearly. No one inside Maison Aurelia seemed to breathe normally anymore. The elegant rhythm of the evening had completely collapsed beneath the weight of exposed arrogance and uncomfortable truth. Guests who minutes earlier had been laughing over imported wine now sat stiffly in silence, pretending to focus on their meals while listening carefully to every word near the entrance. Rain shimmered beneath the city lights outside while Ethan Bennett stood beside Claire with one hand resting calmly near the small of her back. It was not a possessive gesture. It was protective. Steady. The kind of quiet reassurance built through years of loyalty and respect. Laurent forced another uneasy smile while adjusting the cuffs of his tailored jacket. "Mr. Bennett," he said carefully, "please allow us to make this right. Dinner tonight will of course be complimentary." Ethan looked at him for a moment, almost thoughtfully. Then he asked a question so calm it unsettled the entire room even more. "Do you believe my wife was treated this way because your staff thought she could not pay?" Richard hesitated. "Aye, but there was no safe answer. Everyone knew the truth already." Ethan nodded slightly, as though the silence itself had answered for him. Claire shifted uncomfortably beside him. She hated public embarrassment, even when it belonged to someone else. "Ethan," she whispered softly, "we can leave." But Ethan did not move. His eyes swept slowly across the dining room again. At the polished guests, the lowered gazes, the expensive watches and designer suits. "You know what interests me most?" he said quietly. Not one person inside this restaurant questioned what was happening. The sentence landed heavily across the room. A man near the wine bar suddenly looked down at his untouched steak. The older woman wearing diamonds avoided eye contact entirely now. Because Ethan was right. They had all watched it happen. And they had all remained silent. Vanessa stood near the hostess podium gripping a reservation tablet so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. She wanted desperately to regain control of the situation, but every attempt only seemed to make things worse. "Sir," she said carefully, "I was only following restaurant policy." Ethan finally turned fully toward her. Policy. Again, that calm repetition. No raised voice. No insults. Somehow that made it far more devastating. "Tell me," he continued evenly, "would your policy have been different if my wife arrived wearing diamonds and carrying a designer handbag?" Vanessa swallowed hard. "No, sir." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Then why was she told your empty tables were reserved for paying guests?" The room went completely silent. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, but no answer came out. Because there was none. Richard closed his eyes briefly, already realizing the damage unfolding around them was bigger than one bad evening. Reputation in Boston's luxury circles traveled quickly. But humiliation traveled faster. And Ethan Bennett was not simply wealthy. He was respected. The kind of respected money alone could never purchase. Across the room, Emily stood frozen beside the service station watching everything unfold with wide, uncertain eyes. Claire noticed her immediately. The young waitress looked terrified now, probably afraid she might lose her job for speaking up earlier. Claire stepped gently away from Ethan and walked back inside the restaurant for the first time since being removed. The marble floor reflected soft gold beneath her damp boots as dozens of eyes followed her silently across the room. Claire stopped beside Emily and offered her a small warm smile. "Thank you for being kind to me," she said quietly. Emily blinked rapidly, clearly overwhelmed. "I just did what anyone should do." Claire's expression softened sadly at that. Because they both knew that was not true anymore. Not in places like this. Ethan watched his wife carefully from the entrance. Even after being humiliated publicly, Claire's first instinct was gratitude toward the one person who had shown compassion. That was who she was. And suddenly, the contrast between her quiet dignity and the behavior of everyone else inside the restaurant became impossible to ignore. Richard cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Bennet, perhaps we could continue this conversation privately." Ethan looked toward him again. "No," he said simply. "I think everyone here should hear it." Several guests visibly stiffened in their seats. Vanessa felt her stomach sink lower. Ethan stepped slowly into the dining room now, his polished shoes crossing the marble floor with measured calm. The entire restaurant seemed to tense with every step. Then he stopped beside Claire and spoke quietly enough that people leaned forward just to hear him. "My wife spent 20 minutes standing in the cold because your staff decided her appearance mattered more than her humanity." No one moved. No one spoke. Somewhere near the back of the restaurant, a wine glass clinked softly against a plate in shaking hands. And in that unbearable silence, Maison Aurelia no longer looked like the most exclusive restaurant in Boston. It looked small. The silence inside Maison Aurelia no longer felt temporary. It felt permanent, as if the restaurant itself had suddenly become aware of something ugly hidden beneath its polished surface. Candlelight flickered softly across untouched plates and crystal wine glasses, while guests sat motionless beneath the chandeliers, unwilling to interrupt the quiet tension hanging over the room. Ethan Bennet stood beside Claire with calm composure, but everyone could feel the shift in power now. Vanessa certainly could. Just 30 minutes earlier, she had looked at Claire Bennet and seen someone insignificant. Someone easy to dismiss. But now every decision she had made replayed painfully in her mind with terrifying clarity. The condescending tone. The deliberate humiliation. The words paying guests. She wished desperately she could take them back. Richard Laurent stepped closer, lowering his voice carefully. "Mr. Bennet, I assure you this behavior does not represent our values." Ethan looked at him evenly. "Then your values were not visible tonight." Richard had no response. Across the dining room, several customers quietly reached for their phones beneath the tables. News spread quickly in Boston's elite circles, especially when it involved people like Ethan Bennet. Not because he sought attention. Quite the opposite. Ethan rarely appeared publicly unless absolutely necessary. That was why his presence carried so much weight. People feared loud billionaires far less than disciplined ones. Ethan turned slightly toward Claire. "Are you all right?" Claire nodded gently even though the embarrassment still lingered in her eyes. "I just wanted a quiet dinner with you," she admitted softly. Something about the simplicity of that sentence made the room feel even smaller. No demands. No threats. No entitlement. Just a woman who wanted dinner with her husband and was treated like she did not belong because her sweater was not expensive enough. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. Then his eyes moved toward the empty premium tables near the windows. Tables Vanessa had claimed were unavailable. "Interesting," he said quietly. There seemed to be plenty of open seats after all. Vanessa's face burned instantly. A nervous cough echoed somewhere near the bar before quickly disappearing into silence again. Richard straightened his tie anxiously. "Your table is ready now," he offered quickly. Ethan looked toward Claire. "Would you still like to stay?" Everyone in the room waited for her answer. Claire glanced around slowly at the faces staring back at her. Some guilty. Some ashamed. Some simply uncomfortable now that the social hierarchy they trusted had suddenly collapsed in front of them. Then her eyes settled briefly on Emily, the young waitress standing silently beside the service station. The only person who had treated her kindly before anyone knew who she was. Claire gave a small sad smile. "No," she said softly. "I do not think I would enjoy the food anymore." The sentence was gentle, but it cut deeper than anger could have. Vanessa lowered her eyes immediately. Richard's shoulders sank slightly in defeat. Ethan nodded once, as if he had expected the answer already. Then, to everyone's surprise, he walked calmly toward one of the empty dining tables near the center of the room. The guests nearest him shifted nervously in their seats as he reached into his coat pocket and removed a black leather checkbook. He wrote something quietly for several seconds before tearing out the check and placing it on the white tablecloth. Richard stepped closer cautiously and looked down. The color drained from his face again. It was a donation check made out to the Boston Hospitality Scholarship Foundation for $250,000. Beneath the signature line, Ethan had written a single sentence. For employees who understand dignity before luxury. The room went completely still. Ethan turned toward Emily. What are you studying? The young waitress blinked in surprise. Hospitality management, sir. Boston University. Ethan nodded slightly. Keep going. Emily's eyes watered instantly. She pressed trembling fingers lightly against her apron, unable to speak. Vanessa watched the exchange in absolute silence. Because suddenly the difference between her and the young waitress standing beside her had become painfully obvious. One understood service. The other understood status. And only one of those things actually mattered. Ethan walked back beside Claire and gently took the silver gift box from her hands. You carried this in the rain all night? Claire smiled faintly. It was supposed to be a surprise. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before carefully kissing her forehead beneath the warm chandelier light. No performance. No dominance. Just love. Real love. The kind money could never imitate. Then he placed his coat over her shoulders again and guided her quietly toward the entrance. Nobody tried stopping them this time. Nobody dared. The marble floors echoed softly beneath their footsteps while every person inside Maison Aurelia watched in silence. And somehow, as the restaurant doors closed behind them and the cold Boston rain swallowed the sound of the city outside, the most powerful people in the room were no longer the ones wearing expensive suits. The rain had softened into a cold mist by the time the Rolls-Royce pulled away from Maison Aurelia, its dark silhouette disappearing into the glowing Boston streets, while silence lingered behind it like a wound the restaurant could not hide anymore. Inside, no one seemed eager to return to normal conversation. The pianist stared quietly at the keys without playing. Wine sat untouched in crystal glasses. Even the staff moved differently now, slower somehow, as if everyone had suddenly become aware that elegance meant nothing when kindness was absent. Vanessa Cole remained standing near the hostess podium long after Ethan and Claire disappeared from view. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished marble floor beneath the chandeliers, sharp and immaculate on the outside, but hollow underneath. Richard Laurent approached her with controlled frustration simmering behind his expression. My office, he said quietly. Vanessa followed him through the private hallway behind the dining room while nervous employees pretended not to watch. The moment Richard closed the office door behind them, the polished calm he had maintained all evening finally cracked. Do you understand what you have done? He asked sharply. Vanessa folded her arms defensively. I was protecting the image of the restaurant. Richard stared at her in disbelief. The image. He stepped toward the window overlooking the dining room floor. You humiliated the wife of one of the most respected investors in Boston because she wore simple clothes. Vanessa's jaw tightened. How was I supposed to know who she was? Richard turned slowly back toward her. That is exactly the problem. The room fell quiet. Outside the office glass, servers moved nervously beneath the warm lights while guests whispered behind raised wine glasses. Vanessa looked away first. Richard exhaled heavily and rubbed his forehead. Do you have any idea how many businesses Ethan Bennett could have destroyed tonight if he wanted to? Vanessa swallowed but remained silent. But he did not, Richard continued quietly. Do you know why? Vanessa shook her head faintly. Richard's voice lowered. Because people with real class rarely need revenge. The words settled heavily between them. Meanwhile, several miles away, the atmosphere inside the Rolls-Royce felt entirely different from the tension left behind at the restaurant. Soft instrumental music played quietly through the speakers while city lights drifted across the rain-speckled windows. Claire sat beside Ethan wrapped in his coat, her fingers resting lightly on the small silver gift box still unopened in her lap. Neither spoke for several moments. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It never had been. Ethan finally glanced toward her gently. I should have arrived sooner. Claire shook her head immediately. No, your meeting mattered. Ethan's expression softened. You matter more. Claire looked down at the box in her hands, smiling faintly despite everything that had happened. I did not want tonight to become a spectacle. Ethan leaned back slightly in his seat. You know what bothered me most? Claire looked toward him. Not that they judged us, he said quietly. That they felt comfortable doing it publicly. Claire understood exactly what he meant. The humiliation itself had not hurt as deeply as the confidence behind it. The certainty that no one in the room would challenge what was happening. Ethan glanced out at the passing streets thoughtfully. My father used to say something when I was young. Claire smiled softly. What? Ethan's eyes remained on the rain outside. The easiest way to measure a person is to watch how they treat someone who cannot benefit them. Claire rested her head lightly against the leather seat for a moment. Your father sounded wise. Ethan smiled faintly. He drove a delivery truck for 30 years. But he understood people better than most executives I know. Claire looked down at the silver gift box again before finally handing it toward him. Happy anniversary. Ethan blinked in surprise. Claire. She laughed softly for the first time all evening. Open it. Ethan carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested the restored vintage watch that had belonged to his father decades earlier, polished beautifully beneath the soft overhead lights. For a moment, Ethan simply stared at it silently. The emotion in his eyes appeared so suddenly Claire almost looked away. You found it, he said quietly. Claire nodded. It took me 6 months. Ethan lifted the watch carefully into his hand as though it were priceless. In many ways, it was. Not because of money. Because of memory. Because someone who loved him had quietly spent months restoring a piece of his past without expecting recognition for it. Ethan closed the box slowly and looked toward Claire with the same expression he had worn inside the restaurant earlier beneath the chandeliers. Gentle. Certain. Proud. You know, he said softly, they spend all night failing to recognize the most valuable person in the room. Claire smiled faintly and shook her head. Do not start. But Ethan only reached for her hand while the city lights drifted silently across the windows beside them. And somewhere back at Maison Aurelia, long after the wealthy guests finally returned to their conversations, one uncomfortable truth still lingered heavier than the rain outside. The quiet woman they dismissed had never needed luxury to possess dignity. By the following morning, the story had already begun spreading quietly through Boston's luxury business circles. Not through tabloids or public headlines. Ethan Bennett was far too private for that. But in exclusive restaurants, corporate lounges, charity boards, and executive offices across the city, people were whispering about what happened at Maison Aurelia the night before. The details changed slightly depending on who told the story, but one thing remained consistent in every version. A quiet woman had been humiliated because people assumed she did not belong. And the people responsible had deeply underestimated whose respect they had lost. Inside Maison Aurelia, the atmosphere felt colder than usual despite the soft jazz drifting through the dining room speakers. Staff members spoke quietly while avoiding eye contact with Vanessa Cole whenever possible. Normally, she moved through the restaurant with sharp confidence, correcting servers and managing guests with polished control. Today, she looked exhausted. Her makeup remained flawless. Her posture remained perfect. But something underneath had cracked. She stood reviewing reservation lists near the hostess podium when Richard Laurent approached holding a tablet in one hand. You need to see this, he said quietly. Vanessa looked up. Richard turned the screen toward her. It showed an email from a corporate partner withdrawing from an upcoming private event scheduled at Maison Aurelia. Another followed beneath it. Then another. Vanessa's stomach tightened. They're canceling? Richard nodded grimly. Not officially because of last night. Officially, they are citing scheduling conflicts. He lowered the tablet slightly. But everyone knows the truth. Vanessa stared at the screen silently. Richard's voice hardened. Perception matters in this business. Last night damaged more than our reputation. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. So what happens now? Richard looked at her carefully for several seconds before answering. That depends on whether this restaurant learns something from what happened. Across town, meanwhile, Claire Bennett sat quietly inside a small neighborhood cafe far removed from the polished luxury of Maison Aurelia. Warm sunlight streamed through the front windows while the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon drifted softly through the room. Nobody stared at her here. Nobody cared about designer labels or expensive watches. A waitress in sneakers called customers honey while carrying plates of pancakes between crowded tables. Claire preferred places like this. Real places. Ethan sat across from her, stirring cream into his coffee, while the restored vintage watch rested carefully around his wrist for the first time in decades. He caught Claire smiling at it. "You are proud of yourself," he said. Claire laughed softly. "Maybe a little." Ethan shook his head with amusement. "You rebuilt a 40-year-old watch from scratch." Claire lifted one shoulder modestly. "You rebuilt an investment company from one office and a borrowed desk." Ethan smiled faintly. "Fair point." Their food arrived moments later, carried by an older waitress named Diane who greeted them with genuine warmth. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said while placing Claire's pancakes on the table. "And extra bacon for you, handsome." Ethan laughed quietly. "Thank you." Diane glanced briefly at the watch on Ethan's wrist. "Beautiful piece. Family heirloom." Ethan looked toward Claire before answering. "Yes. My wife brought it back to life." Diane smiled warmly. "Sounds like you married the right woman." The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Simple. Casual. Human. Yet somehow it stayed with Claire long after Diane walked away. Because kindness always felt effortless when it was genuine. Meanwhile, back at Maison Aurelia, Emily arrived early for her afternoon shift, carrying textbooks beneath one arm. The moment she entered the restaurant, several coworkers immediately turned toward her. "Emily," one whispered urgently, "Richard wants to see you." Emily froze slightly. Fear settled instantly in her stomach. She had barely slept the night before, worrying she might lose her job for speaking during the confrontation. She slowly made her way toward Richard's office while rehearsing apologies in her head. But when she stepped inside, Richard surprised her completely. "Sit down," he said calmly. Emily obeyed nervously. Richard studied her quietly for a moment. "You showed compassion to someone when nobody else did." Emily blinked uncertainly. "I just thought she looked embarrassed." Richard nodded slowly. "Exactly." He opened a small folder on his desk and slid a paper toward her. Emily looked down in confusion. It was a promotion offer. Assistant floor supervisor. Her eyes widened instantly. "Sir, I do not understand." Richard leaned back in his chair heavily. "Last night reminded me that hospitality is not about impressing wealthy people. It is about making people feel respected." Emily stared silently at the paper while emotion slowly filled her eyes. Richard glanced through the office window toward the dining room, where Vanessa stood silently reviewing reservations alone beneath the chandelier lights. "Some employees understand that naturally," he said quietly. "Others never do." And somewhere across Boston, while sunlight reflected softly against skyscraper windows and morning traffic filled the streets, Claire Bennett remained completely unaware that the quiet dignity she carried so naturally had already begun changing people she would probably never see again.